The Senate floor erupted into chaos when Bernie Sanders, his wild white hair practically vibrating with indignation, pointed an accusatory finger across the chamber at Senator John Neely Kennedy. What started as a routine debate over small business tax relief had devolved into a full-scale ideological war between two of America's most distinctive political voices. Mr. President, Sanders declared, his Brooklyn accent cutting through the formal atmosphere like a rusty blade, I refuse to stand here and listen to the gentleman from Louisiana lecture us about helping working families when he's nothing but a corporate puppet dancing to the tune of his billionaire masters. The accusation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Senators on both sides of the aisle fell silent, their conversations halting mid-sentence. Even the usually stoic presiding officer looked startled by the intensity of Sanders' attack. C-SPAN's cameras captured every moment, broadcasting the confrontation to millions of Americans who had tuned in expecting mundane legislative proceedings. Kennedy, seated calmly at his desk, didn't even look up from the papers he was reviewing. His wire-rimmed glasses caught the chamber's overhead lights as he made a few notes in his distinctive handwriting. The Louisiana senator's complete lack of reaction only seemed to infuriate Sanders further. The senator from Vermont seems to have forgotten his manners, Kennedy finally said, his voice carrying that familiar honey-thick drawl that had become his trademark. He stood slowly, deliberately, like a man who had all the time in the world. But that's all right. Sometimes when folks get worked up, they say things they don't mean. Sanders wasn't backing down. His face was flushed red with passion, his arms gesticulating wildly as he launched into one of his signature populist rants. Corporate puppet. That's exactly what you are. While working families struggle to put food on the table, you're busy protecting tax breaks for multinational corporations and oil companies. The Vermont senator's voice rose to its familiar crescendo, that gravelly tone that had made him a hero to progressive activists nationwide. You talk about small business relief, but we all know who really benefits from your legislation, the same wealthy donors who fund your campaigns. Kennedy smiled that quiet, dangerous smile that made his opponents nervous. He removed his glasses, cleaned them methodically with a small cloth from his pocket, and put them back on. The gesture was so casual, so unhurried, that it seemed to drain some of the energy from Sanders' attack. Well, Bernie, Kennedy began, using Sanders' first name with the familiarity of a concerned uncle, since you brought up my donors, let's talk about facts instead of fiction. The Louisiana senator reached into his jacket and pulled out a familiar folded piece of paper. Senators who had witnessed Kennedy's previous demolition jobs knew this meant trouble. The chamber fell silent, anticipating what was coming next. According to the Federal Election Commission, Kennedy continued, unfolding the paper with theatrical precision, my largest campaign contributors last cycle were small business owners, farmers, and working folks from Louisiana. Average donation, $47. Now, let's talk about your donors, Bernie. Sanders' confident expression began to waver as Kennedy consulted his notes. Your campaign received over $200 million in donations, with an average contribution of $18. Sounds good, right? Except you forgot to mention the $15 million you got from Hollywood celebrities, tech executives, and yes, corporate PACs that somehow found loopholes in your grassroots operation. The accusation landed like a guided missile. Sanders opened his mouth to respond, but Kennedy wasn't finished. And Bernie, since we're talking about corporate puppets, didn't your wife's nonprofit college receive a $10 million loan that mysteriously disappeared? Didn't you buy your third house, that's 3 houses, folks, right after endorsing Hillary Clinton in 2016? The chamber was dead silent. Even Sanders' most loyal progressive allies looked uncomfortable as Kennedy methodically dismantled their champion's credibility. I've got one house, Bernie. It's in Madisonville, Louisiana, worth about $200,000. My wife drives a 2018 Honda Civic. We shop at Walmart like regular folks. So when you call me a corporate puppet, I'm wondering, which one of us is really connected to the people we represent? Sanders was visibly shaken, his usual fire replaced by sputtering indignation. That's not, you're twisting the facts. Kennedy's smile widened. Am I? Because I've got more facts right here if you want to keep going. The C-SPAN footage was already spreading across social media like wildfire. Within minutes, clips of Kennedy's systematic destruction of Sanders were racking up thousands of views on Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok. The hashtag Kennedy destroys Bernie began trending almost immediately. The gentleman from Vermont talks about fighting for working families, Kennedy continued, his voice growing more pointed. But every policy he proposes, Medicare for all, free college, the Green New Deal, would bankrupt those same working families with taxes that would make their heads spin. Sanders tried to interrupt, but Kennedy talked right over him, his Louisiana drawl becoming more pronounced as his passion increased. You want to know what helps working families, Bernie? Jobs. Real jobs, not government handouts. Low taxes so they can keep more of what they earn. Reliable energy so their electricity bills don't break the bank. That's what we do in Louisiana, and that's why our unemployment rate is lower than Vermont's. The comparison stung. Sanders had built his political brand on representing working people, but Kennedy was turning that narrative against him with uncomfortable facts about economic performance. Furthermore, Kennedy pressed, consulting his notes again, you talk about corporate greed, but didn't you just sign a book deal worth over $1 million? Didn't you charge $100,000 speaking fees to colleges while complaining about student debt? That sounds pretty corporate to me. Sanders was now clearly flustered, his typical rhetorical fire reduced to stammering protests. Senator Kennedy, you're engaging in personal attacks. No, Bernie, Kennedy interrupted, his voice still calm but cutting like a blade. I'm engaging in facts. You attacked my character, questioned my integrity, called me a puppet. I'm simply returning the favor with documentation. The Louisiana senator held up his papers again. I've got 12 more pages of your financial dealings right here if you want to continue this conversation. But I suspect the folks watching at home are getting the picture. Social media was exploding. Conservative influencers were sharing the clips with captions like, Bernie Sanders gets destroyed by facts and logic. Progressive activists were scrambling to defend their hero, but the footage spoke for itself. Kennedy's calm demolition of Sanders' accusations was going viral across every platform. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Sanders, the wild-haired socialist firebrand, looked flustered and defensive. Kennedy, the quiet country lawyer, appeared completely in control, armed with facts and delivered with devastating precision. The truth is, Bernie, Kennedy concluded, folding his papers and putting them back in his jacket, the only puppet in this chamber is the one who promises voters everything will be free while getting rich off their donations. The only corporate sellout is the one who attacks capitalism while living like a capitalist. The chamber erupted in scattered applause from the Republican side, while Democrats sat in stunned silence. Sanders, his face red with embarrassment and anger, gathered his papers and stormed out of the chamber, unable to formulate a coherent response to Kennedy's systematic destruction. As news of the confrontation spread, political commentators across the spectrum began weighing in. Conservative media hailed Kennedy's performance as a masterclass in political combat, while progressive outlets struggled to spin Sanders' humiliation into something resembling a victory. The viral clips would be watched millions of times over the following days, cementing Kennedy's reputation as the senator who could dismantle any opponent with nothing but facts and that distinctive Louisiana charm. Sanders, meanwhile, faced the uncomfortable reality that his populist brand had just been exposed as hollow rhetoric by a quiet lawyer from the bayou. The viral explosion that followed Kennedy's Senate floor destruction of Bernie Sanders reached proportions that shocked even seasoned political observers. Within hours of the C-SPAN footage hitting social media, #Kennedy destroys Bernie had become the #1 trending topic worldwide, with over 2.3 million tweets and counting. The quiet senator from Louisiana had just delivered what many were calling the most devastating political takedown in modern Senate history. In his Burlington, Vermont office, Sanders sat slumped in his chair, watching the clips replay endlessly on every news channel. His staff scrambled around him, their phones buzzing constantly with calls from reporters seeking comment on what pundits were already dubbing the Louisiana Massacre. His communications director, a young progressive firebrand who had joined his team straight from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's office, looked shell-shocked. "Senator, we need to respond," she urged, her voice tight with anxiety. "The narrative is getting away from us. Conservative media is having a field day, and even some of our allies are staying quiet." Sanders waved her off dismissively, but his usual defiance seemed hollow. "Let them talk," he muttered, though his eyes never left the screen where Kennedy's calm voice was systematically dismantling his populist credentials for the 100th time that day. Meanwhile, in Baton Rouge, Kennedy was experiencing the opposite phenomenon. His modest Senate office was flooded with calls from major news networks, conservative donors, and Republican leadership. Fox News had offered him a primetime special. Newsmax wanted an exclusive interview. Even CNN, typically hostile to conservative senators, was begging for a statement. Kennedy's chief of staff, a veteran Louisiana political operative, could barely contain his excitement. "Senator, this is unprecedented. Your approval ratings have jumped 15 points overnight, and we're getting calls from Republican committees across the country wanting you to campaign for their candidates." But Kennedy remained characteristically humble, reviewing constituent mail at his desk as if nothing extraordinary had happened. "Just doing my job, Mary," he told his chief of staff. "When someone attacks your character with lies, you respond with facts." That's all this was. The media coverage was unlike anything political observers had seen. Conservative outlets ran wall-to-wall programming dissecting Kennedy's performance. Hannity featured a segment titled "The Art of Political Destruction," analyzing Kennedy's methodical approach. Tucker Carlson devoted an entire show to what he called the death of socialist rhetoric in America. But perhaps more significantly, mainstream media couldn't ignore the story. The Washington Post, typically sympathetic to Sanders' progressive agenda, ran a fact-check piece confirming every detail Kennedy had cited. The New York Times published an analysis titled, "When Populism Meets Reality," noting that Kennedy's statistics about Sanders' wealth and campaign financing were meticulously accurate and devastatingly presented. Even late-night comedy shows, usually reliable defenders of progressive politicians, found themselves in the awkward position of mocking Sanders. The Daily Show ran a segment called "Bernie Gets Burned," while Saturday Night Live featured a sketch of Sanders frantically hiding his multiple houses while Kennedy calmly read from a stack of papers. Social media told an even more brutal story. TikTok creators were having a field day with the footage, creating remixes of Kennedy's "Three Houses, Folks" line that garnered millions of views. One particularly viral video juxtaposed Sanders' millionaire lifestyle with images of struggling Vermont families, set to Kennedy's calm narration about shopping at Walmart. On Twitter, the divide was stark. Progressive activists attempted damage control with hashtags like #StandWithBernie and #FakeNewsAttack, but they were overwhelmed by a tsunami of conservative celebration and moderate voter disgust. One particularly damaging tweet from a Vermont small business owner went viral: "Bernie talks about representing working people while living like a king. At least Senator Kennedy is honest about who he is." The political implications were staggering. Sanders, once considered a potential kingmaker in Democratic politics, suddenly found himself isolated. Progressive colleagues who had once eagerly sought his endorsement began distancing themselves. Even Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, usually quick to defend Sanders, remained conspicuously silent. Behind closed doors, Democratic leadership was in crisis mode. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, already struggling to maintain party unity, called an emergency meeting of the Democratic caucus. According to leaked reports, several senators expressed frustration with Sanders' reckless grandstanding, and its impact on the party's credibility. "Bernie made us all look like hypocrites," one Democratic senator told Politico on condition of anonymity. How do we talk about fighting for working families when our most prominent populist lives in 3 houses and charges college kids 6 figures for speeches? The financial implications were equally devastating for Sanders. Major donors, already skittish about progressive politics after recent electoral setbacks, began pulling their support. A prominent California tech executive who had donated heavily to Sanders' previous campaigns issued a public statement: "I cannot continue supporting politicians who preach about inequality while living in luxury." Small dollar donations, the lifeblood of Sanders' political operation, also took a significant hit. His campaign's daily fundraising totals, typically steady even in off-election years, dropped by over 60% in the week following the Kennedy confrontation. Meanwhile, Kennedy was experiencing the opposite effect. Republican donors flooded his campaign accounts with contributions, many specifically citing his courageous stand against socialist hypocrisy. His quarterly fundraising numbers, typically modest for a senator from a small state, suddenly rivaled those of presidential candidates. More importantly, Kennedy's appeal was crossing party lines in unprecedented ways. Polling data showed significant approval gains among independent voters and even some Democrats who appreciated his straightforward approach to political combat. A CNN poll found that 67% of respondents, including 34% of Democrats, agreed that Kennedy had effectively exposed contradictions in Sanders' message. The senator from Louisiana capitalized on this momentum with a series of carefully planned appearances that reinforced his everyman image. At a town hall in Monroe, he arrived in his wife's Honda Civic, making a point of mentioning the car's 150,000 miles and his pride in driving American-made reliability. "Folks ask me about my response to Senator Sanders," Kennedy told the packed high school gymnasium. "Truth is, I wasn't trying to embarrass anybody. But when someone calls you a corporate puppet while living like a corporate executive, well, that's what we call projection down here." The crowd erupted in applause, but Kennedy's next words showed why his political instincts were so sharp. "Now, I don't begrudge Bernie his success. This is America. If you can write books and make money, good for you. But don't lecture the rest of us about greed while you're counting your millions." The measured tone, acknowledging Sanders' right to wealth while highlighting his hypocrisy, demonstrated Kennedy's sophisticated understanding of political messaging. He wasn't attacking success itself, a dangerous move for any American politician, but rather the disconnect between Sanders' rhetoric and reality. Conservative media strategists took notice. "Kennedy's not just destroying Sanders," noted one prominent Republican consultant. "He's showing how to dismantle progressive rhetoric without seeming mean-spirited or extreme. That's incredibly valuable politically." The strategic implications extended far beyond one Senate confrontation. Kennedy had essentially provided a roadmap for challenging progressive politicians: use their own contradictions against them, rely on documented facts rather than personal attacks, and maintain a respectful tone that prevents accusations of bullying. Republican candidates across the country began studying Kennedy's approach, incorporating his calm, fact-based style into their own campaigns. The Kennedy method became shorthand for effective political combat that appealed to moderate voters tired of partisan screaming matches. As the second week after the confrontation began, Sanders made a desperate attempt at recovery. He scheduled a major speech in Burlington, surrounded by supporters and labor union representatives, designed to refocus attention on his policy agenda rather than his personal wealth. But the damage was done. Even sympathetic audiences seemed skeptical of his populist message after Kennedy's devastating exposure of his contradictions. When Sanders proclaimed that billionaires should not exist, a union worker in the audience shouted back, "What about millionaire senators?" The heckling incident, captured on video and widely shared, seemed to symbolize Sanders' diminished credibility. The man who had built his career on authentic outrage suddenly appeared hollow, his moral authority undermined by uncomfortable facts about his own lifestyle. Kennedy, for his part, continued to handle his newfound fame with characteristic grace. In interviews, he consistently downplayed his role in Sanders' downfall while emphasizing the broader message about political honesty. "This isn't about Bernie Sanders," he told a national television audience. It's about whether politicians mean what they say. If you're going to lecture people about living simply, maybe you should try it yourself. The quiet revolution in American political discourse was complete. Kennedy had shown that voters were hungry for authenticity over rhetoric, facts over feelings, and substance over style. The era of unchallenged progressive grandstanding was over, and John Neely Kennedy was leading the charge toward a more honest political conversation. The transformation of American political discourse reached its crescendo 3 weeks after Kennedy's Senate floor demolition of Bernie Sanders. What had begun as a simple policy disagreement had evolved into a complete realignment of how politicians approached public debate. The quiet senator from Louisiana had not only destroyed Sanders' credibility but had fundamentally changed the rules of political engagement. In Washington, the aftershocks continued to reverberate through every corner of the political establishment. Sanders, once a towering figure in progressive politics, had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of rhetorical overreach. His office, previously bustling with young activists and media attention, now felt like a ghost town. Staff members quietly updated their resumes while Sanders himself retreated from public view, canceling scheduled appearances and avoiding media interviews. The Vermont senator's political isolation was complete. Former allies in the Progressive Caucus began distancing themselves from his brand of populist rhetoric, fearful of being subjected to the same kind of fact-based dismantling Kennedy had delivered. Elizabeth Warren, once Sanders' closest ideological ally, conspicuously avoided mentioning him in speeches. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who had built her career on Sanders-style populist messaging, began moderating her tone and fact-checking her own statements before making them public. The Kennedy effect, as political scientists had begun calling it, was reshaping how politicians prepared for public appearances. Congressional offices across the country were hiring additional research staff to verify every claim before speeches or interviews. The era of unchecked political grandstanding was over. Meanwhile, Kennedy's influence continued to grow in ways that defied traditional political categories. His approval ratings had stabilized at historic highs, with 73% of Americans viewing him favorably according to the latest Gallup poll. More remarkably, his support crossed traditional partisan lines, with 54% of Democrats and 71% of independents expressing positive views of the Louisiana senator. Corporate America took notice of Kennedy's rising star. Fortune 500 CEOs who had grown tired of political theater were drawn to his no-nonsense approach to governance. A group of major business leaders invited Kennedy to address their annual conference in Chicago, an unusual honor for a senator from a relatively small state. In that speech, delivered to 300 of America's most powerful executives, Kennedy articulated a governing philosophy that resonated far beyond partisan politics. Business folks understand something politicians often forget, he told the audience. Results matter more than rhetoric. You can't talk your way out of a bad quarterly report, and you shouldn't be able to govern your way around failed policies with pretty speeches. The audience, typically reserved in their reactions, gave Kennedy a standing ovation that lasted nearly 2 minutes. Several CEOs approached him afterward, expressing interest in relocating operations to Louisiana. The economic development implications were staggering. Kennedy's political success was translating into real benefits for his constituents. But Kennedy's most significant achievement was his influence on the next generation of political leaders. Young Republican candidates across the country began studying his methods, incorporating his fact-based, respectful approach into their own campaigns. The Kennedy School of Political Combat became a formal training program offered by conservative organizations, teaching candidates how to dismantle opponents with documentation rather than derision. Democratic strategists were forced to acknowledge the effectiveness of Kennedy's approach. "He's changed the game," admitted one senior Democratic consultant who requested anonymity. "Voters are responding to authenticity and substance over style and passion. Our candidates need to adapt or get left behind." The adaptation was already beginning. Younger Democratic politicians, witnessing Sanders' humiliation, began moderating their rhetoric and ensuring their personal lives aligned with their public positions. The era of limousine liberalism, wealthy politicians lecturing others about inequality, was effectively over. Kennedy's influence extended to media coverage as well. Journalists, previously content to let politicians make grandiose claims without immediate challenge, began demanding documentation. Cable news shows started featuring fact-check segments during interviews, and producers encouraged hosts to ask follow-up questions about specific statistics and claims. The transformation was most evident during a recent appearance by Sanders on Meet the Press. Host Chuck Todd, armed with Kennedy-style preparation, challenged Sanders on every claim with specific data. When Sanders proclaimed that billionaires don't pay their fair share, Todd immediately countered with IRS statistics showing the top 1% of earners paying 38% of all federal income taxes. Sanders, clearly uncomfortable with the aggressive fact-checking, struggled through the interview, providing the kind of evasive answers that had once been acceptable but now seemed hollow after Kennedy's example. The contrast with Kennedy's direct, documented responses was stark and damaging. Social media reflected the broader cultural shift toward substance over style. Political influencers who had built careers on emotional appeals and vague promises found their audiences demanding specifics. "Show me the numbers" became a common response to political posts, with users citing Kennedy's example of backing up claims with documentation. TikTok, previously dominated by emotional political content, saw a surge in fact-based political commentary. Young creators began producing Kennedy-style videos, calmly presenting statistics and documented evidence to support their positions. The platform's algorithm, detecting increased engagement with substantive content, began promoting these videos over emotional rants. The business community was particularly responsive to Kennedy's approach. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce invited him to deliver their keynote address on regulatory reform, where he outlined Louisiana's business-friendly policies with specific examples of their economic impact. His presentation, backed by detailed statistics and real-world case studies, was viewed over 2 million times online. "Senator Kennedy speaks our language," said the CEO of a major manufacturing company. "He doesn't promise the impossible or blame business for every problem. He shows how good policy creates jobs and prosperity. That's refreshing in today's political climate." The endorsement from business leaders translated into concrete benefits for Louisiana. 3 major corporations announced plans to expand operations in the state, specifically citing Kennedy's leadership and the state's practical approach to governance. The economic impact was projected at over $2 billion and 15,000 new jobs. Kennedy's success also influenced international relations. Foreign diplomats, impressed by his straightforward communication style and policy expertise, began requesting meetings with the Louisiana senator. European Union representatives, frustrated by the emotional rhetoric often found in American politics, found Kennedy's fact-based approach easier to work with. During a trade discussion with German officials, Kennedy's preparation and documentation of trade statistics impressed the delegation so much that they specifically requested future negotiations include him on the American team. "Senator Kennedy understands that successful diplomacy requires facts, not feelings," noted the German trade representative. But perhaps Kennedy's most significant long-term impact was on political education. Universities across the country began incorporating the Kennedy method into their political science curricula. Students learned to research thoroughly, document claims, and present arguments with respectful but devastating precision. Georgetown University's Public Policy School created an entire course called Effective Political Communication, the Louisiana Model, which became one of the most popular electives on campus. Students practiced Kennedy's techniques of calm preparation, factual documentation, and respectful demolition of opposing arguments. The course's popularity reflected a broader hunger among young Americans for a different kind of politics. Polling data showed that 68% of voters under 35 preferred Kennedy's approach to traditional political combat, viewing it as more mature and effective than partisan screaming matches. Sanders, meanwhile, attempted one final comeback effort, scheduling a series of town halls across Vermont designed to reconnect with his base. But even his most loyal supporters seemed different, asking pointed questions about his wealth and challenging his claims with Kennedy-style documentation. At a town hall in Burlington, a local teacher stood up and calmly asked, "Senator, you've earned millions from book deals while advocating for free education. How do you reconcile profiting from the written word while arguing that education should be free?" The question, delivered with Kennedy's characteristic respectful but devastating precision, left Sanders visibly flustered. His stammered response about contributing to important conversations rang hollow in an era where voters expected authentic answers to legitimate questions. The incident, captured on video and widely shared, symbolized the complete transformation Sanders had undergone from feared populist firebrand to diminished political figure unable to defend his own contradictions. Kennedy, observing the continued fallout from his Senate confrontation, remained characteristically humble about his role in reshaping American politics. During a recent interview with local Louisiana media, he downplayed suggestions that he had fundamentally changed political discourse. "I didn't change anything," Kennedy insisted, sitting in his modest Baton Rouge office. "I just reminded folks that truth matters more than style. If that's revolutionary, maybe we've set the bar too low." But political observers recognized the magnitude of Kennedy's achievement. He had not only destroyed Sanders' credibility but had elevated the entire standard of political debate. The era of unchallenged rhetoric was over, replaced by Kennedy's model of respectful but relentless fact-checking. Corporate leaders, foreign diplomats, young voters, and even political opponents had embraced Kennedy's approach, recognizing its effectiveness and authenticity. The quiet revolution in American political discourse was complete, led by a humble senator from Louisiana who proved that sometimes the most powerful political weapon is simply telling the truth. As Kennedy prepared for his next Senate session, reviewing constituent mail and policy documents with his characteristic thoroughness, he remained focused on the work rather than the celebrity. But his legacy was already secure. He had reminded America that good governance requires substance over style, facts over feelings, and authenticity over artifice. The transformation was irreversible. Political candidates across the country were adopting Kennedy's methods, media outlets were demanding higher standards of documentation, and voters were rejecting the kind of empty rhetoric that had once dominated American politics. John Neely Kennedy had not just won a political battle, he had changed the rules of political warfare itself, creating a new standard of accountability that would shape American discourse for generations to come.